Hi, welcome back, everybody. I am super excited to be here today with Claire and Johanna, and we're taking a look at a paper that they did with Rongjin, and that's on titled "Advertising Professionals' Views on Advertising Seemingly Related to Offline Conversations." Very interesting topic, and one that I'm sure is going to get a lot of response from people both in industry and elsewhere. So, thank you so much for being on the podcast and talking about your new article.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yes, thanks.
Of course. Yeah, so to start us off, for people who may not have seen it yet, could you tell us a bit more about what your article examines and how you go about taking a look at that as well, too?
Yeah. So the article is about the topic of conversation-related advertising. So this is kind of like a type of advertising where consumers have the feeling that their phones or other smart devices are listening to their offline conversations, and then they get an ad later on, right? Maybe you have had experienced this where you talk with a friend about like, I need new running shoes, and then not long after that, you're on your phone and you see an ad for running shoes, right? And consumers are really like affected by that. They're taken aback by it. They're like, oh, is my phone listening? So this is like a very persistent folk theory that consumers really believe is happening. But what we have seen from like newspaper articles and statements by like tech companies like Meta, for example, is that they're saying that they're not using this technology. So in order to kind of map this a little bit further, our goal was to kind of survey advertising professionals. So people working in the advertising industry at an agency or a brand side and kind of ask their view on this topic, like to what extent is this happening, right? According to you, why do you think that consumers may believe that this is happening? What might cause this? And also, like, how should we go about this, right? Do you think this might have positive or negative consequences? And do we need to inform consumers and who is responsible for doing that? So we kind of wanted to get the advertising professionals' view on this topic. So we did a survey where we asked some advertising professionals about this. And what we learned is one is that it's technically possible. That's what they're saying. Almost everyone said yes, it's technically possible, right? But at the same time, the majority also says, but it's not happening. Although this was not a conclusive result, there were also a lot of people who said, actually, I don't know either. And there were also a couple that said, yes, it's happening. The problem is that we also asked follow-up questions like, okay, what is your evidence for either it's not happening or what is your evidence for yes, it is happening? And the couple people who said yes, they didn't give they couldn't give a concrete campaign or like an example. And a lot of times when they said yes, it's happening, they actually gave an example from their perspective as a consumer, right? It happened to me as well. When I talked about this, this also happened to me. But when we asked the people who said, no, this is not happening, they actually gave a couple like concrete arguments that we categorize into four categories. So one is a lot of the media planners in our sample said it's just not an option that we can select, right? If we
Mm,
plan a media campaign. It's not that we can click somewhere that says conversation related advertising or targeting based on phones listening or listening
yeah.
data. That's not an option that they have to select. The second argument that they provide is just it's unnecessary. Like the amount of data that's already collected on consumers online, the volume and the quality of the data kind of makes it obsolete to also listen to people, which to me personally is a little bit scarier than, that the phones are also listening. They already know so much about you that they don't need to listen, basically. The third one is technical difficulties. So even though they say it's technically possible, they still say it's there's still some challenges, right? So technically, so for example, to really distinguish words with the microphones, speakers might be covered, there might be background noise, it might
Mm,
interfere, the tone might be difficult to pick up. So even though yes, it's technically possible, there might still be a lot of technical challenges. And then the last one is also there might be legal repercussions, right? As long as you don't get people's consent that their audio can be collected and used for commercial purposes, they cannot do it. And as far as they know, there isn't any consent asked for this kind of data to be used. So that's kind of the first finding that we found.
It's really interesting as a topic because it consistently comes up with students. I'm sure you get that as well too, where they all think that this is an option and think that it's possible. And I always tell them it's, it's like your battery probably would be like terrible if this was actually happening, right? Because it would just take up so much power to kind of go through and be like the confirmation bias as well too. I wonder, is it just like people remember certain instances where these two things connect, but a lot of the times it probably actually doesn't happen and we don't really notice that as much, right?
Yeah, so that is actually part of like when we asked the advertising professionals, why would you think that people still believe in this, right? Even though it might not be happening. And there were different examples. So one is indeed confirmation bias, right? If you believe that this is happening, you see examples and you find evidence around you for this happening. The other is also related to like a psychological mechanism. It's called priming. So, for example, you may have received the ad either way. But just because you just talked about the topic, now all of a sudden the ad stands out to you, right? It becomes conscious. Maybe you even were exposed to it unconsciously before you have seen it, but you didn't consciously process it. So you start talking about it and then you see it again. So that's priming, right? It makes it top of mind. It's the same with, like, let's say you just bought a certain bag from a certain brand, and all of a sudden you see everyone around you having that same product. And it's the same with if you just talked about something, all of a sudden you see like things related to what you just talked about around you. And then again, the quality and the predictive analysis is another explanation, as well as the product and the brand advertised might be part of a trend, and what you're talking about might also be part of a trend as well, right? So I heard once in a podcast where they were like, "Oh yeah, I was just talking about a parasol, like I needed a big umbrella for my balcony, but it was also summertime, right? So it's also logical that you get ads
Yeah.
for these kind of products
Mm.
in the summer." So a lot of times there are alternative explanations. It's just sometimes easier for people to use the conversation as the piece of evidence rather than think about other explanations that might be there as well.
I guess at the same time, it's sort of it's not super far-fetched for people to imagine this because of just how much data people really don't realize is being collected, right? And this is just kind of an extension, I guess, of kind of going in that direction, as you mentioned earlier, right? And this is kind of, I guess, sort of a segue into the next question of what does this mean for advertising professionals, right? Should we be more concerned that people do think this so much and trying to counter it, or is it just not a big deal? Or like, are there things we should be thinking about as an industry?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, let me jump
Yeah.
in on it because I think it's very interesting question. First of all, right, we talk about the perception that people have that something is happening and not that something is happening. And I think that was also a big part of the survey to really try to understand what, in this case, the advertising professional, what is the actual situation, what is actually going on. So is the data being used versus people believing that the data is being used? And those are two separate things that the survey also very much showed us. What I found also very interesting in this regard, we often talk about this information asymmetry, right, between the industry and the consumer. Consumers don't really understand data collection. Then they try to come up with explanations like the listening to make sense of all the things that are happening to them online. But what was very interesting in this study, which focused on the professionals, was that we also saw this information asymmetry happening within the industry itself. So there was quite a lot of confusion, like, okay, is this happening? People saying, yeah, I think it's technically possible and I think it's happening, but then not being able to provide evidence for it. And having the same experience as the consumer. So we kind of see that, especially advertisers, maybe compared to, for example, platforms, which often, right, would be the party that owns the data, collects the data, processes the data, that there is this information asymmetry happening there as well. And the advertisers themselves don't really know what data is being used for their campaigns. They just select certain targeting criteria. And then they also trying to understand, okay, why are these specific people seeing my campaign? So there is maybe this internal kind of within industry awareness raising necessary to better understanding, okay, so what is the exact data being used? How does this work? So I think that's one of the things that the data, especially the study of practitioners, shows. We also need better awareness within the industry of what is exactly going on with the amounts of data that are being collected.
Yeah, and in order
Yeah.
to make this happen too, there might be some legal mandate necessary for like platforms to be more transparent too about their data collection practices, right? Because like what some of the people said, even though it's not an option to select, we also cannot really see how the data sometimes is collected or comprised. We just use it. And that's maybe where that asymmetry comes from as well.
Yeah, very true. I mean, like the algorithms, like, we broadly kind of know what goes into it, but it's not a clear recipe of exactly what's in it or what data is necessarily being collected. So it's very opaque in some ways, right? Yeah.
Mhm.
I'm curious as well too. I think it's always interesting. Where did the idea come from for this topic? Was this something you folks had been thinking about, or just you've been reading a lot about, or where did you kind of, see the spark for this? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so we already mentioned we have a third author who's not here today, Jeannie, who was a master's student in her program. So we kind of started the project together, and it really started in the classroom, actually. So when we ask a lot of students questions, if we teach like digital advertising or psychology of advertising or like these kind of classes, and we talk about personalization or algorithms, a lot of times we just ask students to come up with their own examples, right? Can you think of an example where you got an ad that you felt like was personalized to you? And when I taught this over the years, usually I got examples like for online behavioral advertising, right? I searched for flight tickets, and then not long after that, I got ads for what I searched for or what you clicked on, right? So based on your online behavior. But over the years, these kind of topics have shifted a little bit towards more like examples where students came up with like, I've talked about this, and all of a sudden this pops up. So this really started in the classroom where students, like more and more students, brought this up as an example, like this is happening to me, which really started to fascinate me and the team that I'm working with. So we actually started with a consumer survey where we asked people in the United States, Poland, and the Netherlands like, to what extent have they had the feeling that they received an ad that was seemingly related to a previous offline conversation? And we found that, especially in the US, like almost 78% of the respondents in that survey said, yes, we've had this happen to us. And when we asked them, why do you think it was related to the conversation? 72% of those people said that it's somewhat to very likely that their devices are listening to them. So this is a very big and persistent belief among consumers. And this was a survey, right? So you always have to be careful about self-report. But I've also seen several qualitative studies, also by other authors, that report similar phenomena that people come up with this as example for personalization around smart speakers, around smartphones, that they really have the feeling that it's listening. So this really sparked this whole new research idea. And then especially like wanting to know the other side of it. Okay, if this is such a persistent belief among consumers, like we really wanted to figure out the advertising professionals' perspective, right? Like how do they see it? How do they experience it? And yeah, that was actually really kind of how this whole project started. And especially with Ginny coming into our program, our master's program, she was like, I'm very excited to do research. And I think this topic is really interested. And so we dove in, and that's kind of how this whole project started rolling.
That's awesome. Yeah. One of the other things I'm always excited to ask about is challenges in the research process. I think this is something we don't talk enough about, especially from the perspective of younger scholars. You often see these beautiful published articles and don't see the work that goes into it. So I'm wondering, were there any challenges you experienced when going through and working on this project? And if so, how did you overcome them? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, especially for this study we conducted, because it was conducted with practitioners, which is not the like usual target group that we work with, right? We often
Yeah.
conduct studies among consumers. So that was like new and additional challenges that we may be not experiencing in other like surveys or experiments that we do online. And one of the big challenges that we struggled with quite a lot when doing the study was the recruitment. So how do you convince like these super busy people that work in the agencies to actually spend some time on our survey? And we've had a lot of different ways to try to reach them. We worked from like alumni network of University of Minnesota, for example, using their professional master, but also using databases with advertising professionals to just like cold email people as well. And we did see the big difference, for example, between cold emailing, which is often much less effective, versus right using the existing networks that we had to reach out to people. So that was something that was an interesting experience. Also, we tried, for example, like framing how do you sell your study to a professional? What is the goal of it? Why would they participate in it? That's something we also played around quite a bit with. And especially for this study, so we talked earlier about this idea of this, we talk about perceptions, right? Something that's most likely not happening. You mentioned, Colin, that you give your students like explanations. Why wouldn't this be happening? Most likely, we do the same. And then if someone who believes that sees a survey on the topic like, hey, are our phones listening, as a professional, maybe they think like, hey, it's not real, like why would I do this, what kind of survey is this? So I think we had that issue of this selection bias, maybe skepticism of some of the potential participants that we had to overcome, to really tell them like, we're not trying to prove or something that phones are listening, and we're looking for like practitioners' words and experiences to kind of find evidence, but we're trying to openly see what do they think about the consumer experiences. And that's something that was like quite a challenge. How do you frame it in an open way and get answers that are really really open and really share their experiences, not thinking about, okay, maybe I shouldn't say that, maybe this is not interesting, maybe it's not happening, so I don't want to participate in it. So I think the recruitment side of it and getting the answers was quite a challenge. Another thing related to it, especially to this practitioner survey side, was something that we noticed, is the type of answers or the experiences that were mentioned, especially when we ask for evidence. So Claire mentioned earlier, we often would ask like, hey, do you think this is something that is happening? And then we would ask them, do you have any examples where this happened? And what we expected were examples from the professional practice, right? Like, oh, we were running a campaign and then this is what we discussed, or this is how we decided to use certain data. But some of the examples we got were actually related to just the daily experiences. Another of these, oh, I talked with my friend about this and then I got an ad for something. Because obviously every professional, every practitioner is also a consumer. So we are wearing these different hats. And that was something that's actually difficult to distinguish. Also, we're writing up the results and analyzing the data. Where do you draw a line that this is actually what we were asking about in our research questions? What do professionals think versus what do consumers think? So I think that's something that was actually a challenge that we really had to be really conscious about when analyzing our data.
Yeah, no, definitely. It looks so, beautiful put together, but it definitely must have been a lot of work going through getting all that, collated and put together as well. So where to next as we kind of round out? Like, what are the big topics you think that could be extended using your research?
Yeah, well, I feel like there's still a lot to explore here, right? But related to one of the findings, so we also really asked advertising professionals to what extent do you think this is like an effective strategy, for example? Like, what do you anticipate as the most positive and negative consequences? Which to me was interesting that they very much overlap with the general consensus on personalized advertising. We see both the convenience and the ease and economic benefits as the positive effects, and both the creepiness and the privacy infringement as the negative potential consequences. But we also asked them, like, okay, how should we deal with this, right? If you're saying that this is not happening, so how should we inform consumers who believe this is happening? And then, even though it might not be actually true, when people have those perceptions, it can have negative backlash, right, towards the ad. So
Mm,
maybe you have just such a good algorithm that you predict something that they just talked about, right? And then consumers may feel, okay, this is based on my conversation, and therefore they feel more negative towards the ad than maybe they otherwise would have done. So, are there maybe some strategies that we can use to inform consumers more about the data collection process, right? Where is the data coming from? And according to our survey, the advertisers also agree that transparency tools might be needed to further inform consumers. So this could be a really interesting next avenue for research, like studying like how to most effectively inform consumers who believe that this is happening. And from our previous survey on consumers, we see like kind of three groups, like one who strongly believe that this is happening, right? A group who strongly like, no, this is ridiculous. Of course, this is not happening. This is a conspiracy theory. And then we have this big group in the middle who's kind of on the fence, who's like, it's probably not happening, but still, it's too much of a coincidence that this is happening. And I think that middle group would be really interesting because they're probably the group who can be informed most, but it would be interesting to see if there's maybe different strategies necessary depending depending on where people are on the spectrum of thinking that this is happening. And maybe we can learn something from other literature on like once people believe in certain things, how can you inform them or convince otherwise, right? If you strongly believe in this is happening, it might be really hard to
Yeah.
change that specific belief. But I feel like there's still a lot to explore. And at the same time, also figuring out a little bit more the why question, like why do consumers believe this, right? Are there certain aspects of the ad that makes them more likely to believe in this? So for example, one study that what's still under like in progress right now is where we looked at the timing, right? Does it matter like how fast, for example, the conversation after the ad after the conversation appears, might that also impact, for example, to what extent people connect it to? Because as you mentioned before, there's different data sources, but some might be more unconscious and some might be more conscious, right? A conversation is very, people are more aware of that they're having a conversation on a certain topic, but a click on a link or that might not be as conscious, right? So even though people have searched for it, they may still attribute it to the conversation just because it's a more something that they're more aware of. And it might be something that is like a logical for them explanation or a likely explanation. Also because, you know, when you download an app, it asks for microphone access, right? So you kind of get prompted and primed with these kind of cues that might give you an idea of, okay, there is a possibility that my microphone is being used right now. So looking a little bit more into that why question, like why do consumers believe that? And at the same time, more like from the advertising side, like, okay, how can we inform consumers and how can we maybe mitigate these negative potential consequences that consumers experience? Because again, what Joanna said, we're balancing something with perceptions and reality, right? So how do you provide practical implications for something that's may only consist in the consumer's minds, right? Like the perceptions, like it's not that advertisers can do anything specifically maybe with the ad if they're not using that strategy. So that might be one thing. And then there could be a legal mandate too, like providing more transparency on the maybe
Mhm.
tech company side, on the data collection processes, the black boxes of the algorithms, things like that, which may also ease consumers' mind. Because what we saw from our survey comparing the US and European participants is that we saw that the perception in Europe was lower. And one of our explanations, it might be because of the strict privacy regulations in Europe, that people feel more likely that this is actually not allowed, right? This should not be happening. So yeah, many ideas, many different avenues for people to explore this topic. So I feel like there might be some good opportunities for people maybe who are listening right now to study this topic as well.
But definitely very interesting. I think, just playing with it, right? And it's challenging as well too, because I think it's not just one product category that they could, know that this is what people talk about. It seems like it's very random, just from like, experiences we've all talked about and things I've heard about as well too. Like it's not just clothing or something like that you can they could purposely be a little bit more vague when in terms of how they target. But it seems to be across the board, this kind of stuff pops up and people think it's happening.
But
So,
people may respond to it differently depending on the type of product. So that could be another interesting
yeah,
research avenue, right? Like I've even heard an example where someone was like, I was talking to my doctor about something and then I got prescription drugs or I got like drug advertising. And that may feel way more invasive than if you get running shoes after you talk with your
right.
friends about running shoes, right? So that could also be a potential interesting avenue to study, like the different types of products and how people respond to yeah, this type of I cannot really say this type of advertising if it's not a type of advertising, but yeah, this perception,
Yeah.
this type of advertising.
Oh, very interesting. Well, thank you again for coming on. And for those who are interested, it's in the March issue of JAR, and it's titled Advertising Professionals' Views on Advertising Seemingly Related to Offline Conversations. So thank you again for taking the time to come on and tell us about your amazing research.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.